you very much, Esther Gidui-Ewart, and welcome back to Straight Talk Africa, live from Washington. Once again, it's time to bring in my colleague and social media reporter. Take it away again, Ayen.
Thanks, Shaka. We received tremendous feedback in our STA inbox to this week's question. The Millennium Challenge Corporation's board of directors voted recently to suspend its partnership with the government of Tanzania due to actions inconsistent with MCC's eligibility criteria. This leads us to our question of the week, which asks, what role do you think development partners should take in promoting democracy and good governance in Africa? Before we begin, I'd like to thank all of you for using our social media platform to communicate with us. And another reminder that we are tweeting live today. Use the hashtag VOA Democracy Governance. And if you haven't yet, please follow us at VOA Shaka. And speaking of, let's go to a tweet from Mozem, who tweets, development partners need to take a decisive role. Prior methods don't seem to work effectively. In fact, they favor despots. Now to a comment from Facebook fan Nicodemo Nkezi in Arusha, Tanzania, who writes, the development partners have nothing to do with developing Africa because their real intent is not to develop Africa, but to get what they want. They support leaders who can satisfy their own interest and not the interest of the people. Well, Shaka, two thought-provoking yet critical views here. What's your take?
Very interesting. Let me toss it to Beth.
Yes.
Your reaction?
Look, I mean, my reaction is that you know, if an organization is using an incentive structure, I think there is great incentive for a country to do the right thing. But I would also agree that this needs to be in the hands of the people. And I think that what you saw recently with the board's decision to suspend Tanzania was in direct response, really, to what the people on Zanzibar were experiencing. So there is a direct connection between, in this case, the action of a development partner and the will of the people. That's not to say that it always works that way, but I think there are examples where you see what the people want really have an impact on what happens between a development partner and a developing country government.
And what are those other branches, for example, of the U.S. government, really? Where are they when they are needed in this context?
Well, I think, let's be frank, Shaka. Every country in the world pursues in its foreign policy its interests. And where countries have good relations, it's where interests converge. And I think on development issues and good governance, America's interests, whether it be in stability and security, whether it be in economic partnerships, all converge with Africans' interests in good governance and democracy. Our best economic partners are countries that are open and societies that are transparent. Our most stable countries are those where the governments are legitimate in the eyes of the people. Now, does this work sometimes when we have policymakers of either party who have to make decisions or feel they have to make decisions based on short-term interests or decisions? You know, certainly sometimes it's less than ideal. But at the end of the day, if one is really looking at it, our long-term interests and those of our friends do converge because what they want, legitimacy in government and service, are what we want because that makes for more stable partners, more prosperous countries with whom we can do business.
Emilia, I don't have problems, obviously, for countries to have their own vital national security interests. But when you talk about African interests, really, are these African people's interests or are they interests, probably, of those individuals who occupy State House at some point in time?
Yeah, well, you know, Shaka, you hit the nail on the head always. Huh? It is, you know, interest being very narrowly defined. If you think about even the interest for the U.S., it's often defined by U.S. companies interested in Africa's natural resources. Very narrowly defined. It's also defined by the U.S. military. Right now, very focused on countering terrorism. Very narrowly defined, often out of very short-term interests that are driven by a narrow elite. I love that we now have the Panama Papers that can shed some light on the elite and how it's working, right? But it is these relationships that are rigging the rules. And often, you know, you think about the longest relationship the U.S. and Africa is Egypt, right? I mean, Egypt, which was for a long time strongest partner with the U.S., second in terms of assistance from the U.S. after Israel, right? Mm-hmm. was a military dictatorship and still is today a military dictatorship,
and
right?
There was no coup.
In spite of the fact that there is no democracy, the U.S. maintains it as a #1 ally and partner. Why? Because of a very narrow analysis of U.S. interests. And I think we've got to unpack that and question it. And I'm so grateful for the straight talk of the folks like the person in Arusha who gave the comment, because I think we have to look with a critical eye. And this is an opportunity to do that.
We'll come back to that and more later. Ayen, do you have more reaction from the audience, please?
Yes, we do have more reaction. In fact, let's go to another comment from a Facebook fan, Ayen Ronald in Bushenyi, Uganda, who writes, Shaka, I think good governance is not the epitome for development in Africa. It's a fallacy. We need a new direction in almost every sector. This includes prior economic systems that excluded the so-called developing partners. Those systems were used to stifle, exploit, and change our education systems and culture. And our last Facebook comment comes from Magezi Wilson, who writes, development partners in Africa should preach the gospel of democracy, adhering to term limits, and to emulate the USA as a role model. Shaka, a few interesting suggestions here. What's your take?
Very interesting. Beth, of course, you had someone saying that perhaps what is needed may in fact be a new paradigm shift. Your reaction?
I don't know that that's necessary. I think there are a lot of tools out there that can be used to good effect. And I'd say that one of the key themes that I think has emerged over the conversation over the Sustainable Development Goals in the last several years has been the conversation about the availability of data and transparency. And I think that a lot of times it's used by development partners to talk about how we need to be accountable to our stakeholders here at home. So in the case of MCC, the American taxpayer. But I think just as important, it's to be accountable to our stakeholders in developing countries. The people deserve to know what's coming into their country, what it's being spent on, what the priorities are, and not only to know that, but to have a hand in actually setting those priorities. And I think that if donor agencies, if development partners work with developing countries together to make sure that the kinds of funds that are going into those countries are actually in line with the priorities of the people, and that the people have a voice in determining what that money's spent on, and then that there's an accountability loop to make sure that people understand, whether those dollars actually achieved the objectives they were designed to achieve. That's where progress is going to come from, and that will feed into increasing democracy, as Amira said, from the bottom up.
Very interesting, because in fact there needs to be accountability, but accountability to who? You see, earlier I talked about who is the primary stakeholder in Africa. African leaders who are less democratic, they hold or organize elections for the purpose of pleasing or pandering to the development partners. That is who they account to, not their own people.
And I think, however, Shaka, I think that's changing. And I think Beth is being a little modest. If you want to talk about paradigm shifts, the creation of the Millennium Challenge Corporation was itself a significant paradigm shift in development relationships. It set out objective criteria, which these countries are measured against, the very indices. It also it involves them in designing the compacts. Once they pass the threshold stage, they lay out what their major infrastructure or structural agenda is, and it's a dialogue between partners. So that itself is a shift. Is it perfect? Certainly not, but we've come a long way. It was developed under the Bush administration, and the Obama administration has maintained the same high levels of engagement and funding for it. So I think it's a work in progress, but I think we have to acknowledge that the development assistance paradigm is certainly not what it was when you and I began our careers working on Africa. And it's shifting, and it will probably change in the coming years.
Very interesting. Thank you very much, Ayen, for sharing with us this week's audience reaction.
Absolutely. It's been a pleasure. And that does it for today's social media segment. Just a reminder that we appreciate all the feedback, whether it's in social media form or using other means to communicate to us. Please keep them coming. And if you are a new fan, drop us a line at africatv@voanews.com. Once again, our email address is africatv@voanews.com. Or post your comment on our Facebook page. Enter the keywords Straight Talk Africa. Be sure to visit us online at voaafrica.com, or you can join our YouTube channel, sign up to VOA TV to Africa, and follow us on Twitter at VOA Shaka. A reminder that the show is streaming live every Wednesday. Go to VOA Straight Talk Africa TV program page on our website, or simply watch us live on your mobile device. Just download the app. Just download the VOA mobile app. Now, let's take a look at what's on tap for next week's program.